when 12-year-old Marcus Thompson walked into the Century 21 Theater that humid Saturday afternoon in downtown Philadelphia. He had no idea that his worst day would become the moment that changed everything. The boy clutched his crumpled $5 bill, money he'd saved from 3 weeks of collecting bottles and doing odd jobs around his neighborhood, completely unaware that within the next hour he would meet someone who would alter the trajectory of his entire life. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. This tale of unexpected kindness happened right here in America, but its message reaches across the globe. The theater lobby buzzed with the typical Saturday crowd. Families lined up at the concession stand, the air thick with the aroma of buttered popcorn and the sticky sweet scent of candy. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing excitedly at movie posters plastered across the walls. The newest action blockbuster had just been released, and everyone seemed eager to escape into 2 hours of entertainment. Marcus stood apart from the crowd, not by choice, but by circumstance. His clothes, though clean, bore the telltale signs of a family struggling to make ends meet. His jeans had patches on both knees, sewn with care by his grandmother's weathered hands. His sneakers, once white, had faded to a dull gray, with duct tape holding the sole of his left shoe together. But it wasn't his appearance that would soon draw unwanted attention. It was something far more personal and heartbreaking. The boy suffered from a rare digestive condition that his single mother, Patricia Thompson, couldn't afford to treat properly. Working 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night and stocking shelves at a grocery store during the day, Patricia barely earned enough to keep food on the table and rent paid. Medical insurance was a luxury they simply couldn't afford, and Marcus's condition often caused embarrassing symptoms that no 12-year-old should have to endure. As Marcus approached the ticket counter, his excitement was palpable. He'd been looking forward to this movie for months, saving every penny he could find. The teenage girl behind the counter, Amanda Kim, gave him a sympathetic smile as he carefully unfolded his wrinkled bills and counted out exact change for the matinee showing. "Enjoy the movie, sweetie," she said kindly, handing him his ticket. Marcus beamed with genuine joy as he made his way toward Theater 7. The afternoon showing wasn't crowded, which suited him perfectly. He preferred the back rows, anyway, where he could watch in peace without feeling self-conscious about his appearance or his condition. He settled into seat H14, right in the middle of the back row, and waited for the previews to begin. The first sign of trouble came about 20 minutes into the film. Marcus felt the familiar cramping in his stomach, followed by the uncomfortable bloating that signaled an episode was beginning. He tried to ignore it, focusing intently on the action unfolding on screen, but his condition had other plans. A soft, involuntary sound escaped him, followed by an unmistakable odor. At first, nobody seemed to notice. The theater was dark, and the movie's soundtrack masked most sounds. But as Marcus's condition worsened, the symptoms became harder to ignore. A middle-aged woman 2 rows ahead turned around with a disgusted expression, whispering something to her husband. Soon, other patrons began looking around, trying to identify the source of their discomfort. Marcus sank lower in his seat, his face burning with shame. He knew what was happening, and he knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. His condition didn't care about his dignity or his desperate desire to simply enjoy a movie like any other kid. The cramping intensified, and despite his best efforts, another episode occurred. This one impossible to ignore. "Oh my God! What is that smell?" a teenage girl whispered loudly to her friend, her voice carrying in the quiet theater. "It's disgusting," her friend replied, not bothering to lower her voice. "Someone needs to do something about this." Marcus felt tears stinging his eyes. He'd experienced this humiliation before, at school, on the bus, in grocery stores, but somehow Having it happen during his long-awaited movie felt especially cruel. He considered leaving, but he'd spent his hard-earned money on this ticket, and this might be his only chance to see the film. The situation escalated when Vincent Bradley, a well-dressed man in his 40s sitting several rows ahead, stood up and turned around. Vincent worked in corporate sales and was accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and aggressive confrontation. He'd brought his 2 children to the movie, and his afternoon was not going according to plan. "Whoever is causing this needs to leave immediately," Vincent announced loudly, his voice cutting through the movie's dialogue. "This is unacceptable. We paid good money for these tickets." Other patrons began murmuring in agreement. Someone called out, "Yeah, this is ridiculous." Another voice added, "Get the manager." Marcus wanted to disappear into his seat, but Vincent's eyes had found him. The man's gaze was cold and accusatory as he pointed directly at the trembling 12-year-old. "You," Vincent said, his voice filled with disgust and authority. "You need to leave, now. You're ruining everyone's experience." I can't help it," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the movie's soundtrack. "I have a medical condition." Vincent scoffed loudly. "I don't care what your excuse is, kid. You don't belong here if you can't control yourself. This is a public place, and you're being inconsiderate to everyone else." The confrontation was drawing more attention. Several other patrons had turned around to watch the scene unfold, their expressions ranging from disgust to sympathy to curiosity. Marcus felt completely exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. "Please," Marcus said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I saved for 3 weeks to buy this ticket. I just want to watch the movie." Vincent stepped closer, his presence looming and intimidating. "Look, kid, I understand you might have problems, but that doesn't give you the right to ruin everyone else's experience. There are other people here who deserve to enjoy their Saturday afternoon without dealing with this situation." A woman named Rebecca Cooper, sitting with her family, joined Vincent's protests. "He's right," she said, her voice sharp with irritation. "If you can't control your bodily functions, you shouldn't be in public spaces. It's not fair to the rest of us." Marcus's shoulders began to shake as he fought back tears. The movie continued playing on the big screen, but nobody was watching anymore. All attention was focused on the humiliated boy who had become the center of an ugly confrontation. "I'm not doing it on purpose," Marcus tried to explain, his voice growing smaller with each word. "The doctors said it's because of my digestive system. My mom can't afford the medicine that might help." This admission seemed to make some patrons even more uncomfortable. Instead of generating sympathy, Marcus's explanation seemed to reinforce their desire to remove him from their presence. Vincent crossed his arms and shook his head dismissively. "That's not our problem, son. Life isn't fair, and sometimes people have to make sacrifices. If you can't afford proper medical care, maybe you can't afford to go to movies either." The cruelty of Vincent's words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd encountered meanness before, but something about this man's calculated indifference felt particularly harsh. Other children Marcus's age watched from their seats as their parents participated in or silently approved of his humiliation. Just then, the theater manager, Kevin Smith, appeared in the aisle. Someone had clearly summoned him to address the situation. Kevin was in his mid-20s, working his way through college, and he looked uncomfortable with the confrontation he was walking into. "What seems to be the problem here?" Kevin asked. Though the answer was unfortunately obvious, Vincent immediately took charge of the conversation. "This kid has been disrupting our movie experience with bodily functions. We've asked him to leave, but he's refusing. We need you to handle this situation professionally." Kevin looked at Marcus, who was now visibly crying, despite his efforts to maintain composure. The manager found himself in an impossible position, balancing customer satisfaction with basic human decency. "Son," Kevin said gently, Maybe it would be better if you stepped outside for a few minutes, just until things settled down. Marcus shook his head desperately. Please, I spent all my money on this ticket. I've been looking forward to this movie for months. I promise I'll try to control it. You can't promise that, Vincent interjected harshly. If you could control it, this wouldn't be happening in the first place. You're being selfish, and you're old enough to understand that. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. Nearly half the theater was now involved in or watching the argument. Some patrons demanded refunds, others called for Marcus's immediate removal, and a few sat silently, perhaps feeling uncomfortable with the situation but unwilling to speak up. Marcus realized that his presence was only making things worse for everyone, including himself. The movie he'd dreamed of seeing had become secondary to his public humiliation. With tears streaming down his face, he slowly stood up from his seat. "I'm sorry," he whispered to no one in particular. "I didn't mean to ruin anyone's day." As Marcus began to make his way toward the aisle, preparing to leave the theater and abandon his hard-earned ticket, something extraordinary was about to happen. Unbeknownst to everyone in Theater 7, someone had been watching this entire confrontation unfold. Someone whose presence would transform this moment of cruelty into something entirely different. The boy took one last look at the movie screen, where larger-than-life heroes were fighting impossible battles and always finding a way to win. In that moment, Marcus felt like the opposite of a hero. He felt small, powerless, and utterly defeated by circumstances beyond his control. Little did Marcus know that his own hero was about to appear, not on the movie screen, but right there in the theater aisle. Sometimes the most powerful moments in our lives happen when we least expect them, and sometimes the people who change everything show up exactly when we need them most. As Marcus shuffled toward the aisle, his head hung low in defeat, a figure emerged from the shadows near the theater's back entrance. The man had been standing there quietly, having arrived late and choosing to remain in the back rather than disturb other moviegoers by searching for a seat in the dark. He had witnessed the entire confrontation unfold, and what he'd seen had stirred something deep within him, a mixture of protective instinct and righteous anger that he hadn't felt in years. Sylvester Stallone had come to the Century 21 Theater that afternoon, seeking the same thing most people wanted from movies, a brief escape from reality. At 68 years old, the legendary actor had been dealing with his own personal struggles. His recent films hadn't performed as expected at the box office. Critics had been particularly harsh about his age and relevance in modern Hollywood, and he'd been questioning whether his best days were behind him. He'd chosen this small neighborhood theater specifically because he wanted to watch a movie without being recognized, to simply blend in with regular people and remember what it felt like to be an ordinary audience member. But there was nothing ordinary about what he'd just witnessed. Stallone had grown up poor in Hell's Kitchen, New York, sleeping in subway stations and struggling with his own speech impediment that made him the target of bullies and cruel comments throughout his childhood. He understood what it meant to be different, to be mocked for things beyond your control, and to feel powerless in the face of public humiliation. Watching this young boy endure such treatment had awakened memories of his own painful experiences and triggered an immediate, visceral response. As Marcus approached the back of the theater, still crying and clutching his empty popcorn container, Stallone stepped forward into the dim light cast by the movie screen. His presence was commanding even in the darkness. Broad shoulders, weathered face marked by decades of both triumph and struggle, and eyes that held a depth of understanding that comes only from personal experience with hardship. "Excuse me, son," Stallone said quietly, his distinctive voice gentle but firm. "Where are you going?" Marcus looked up, wiping his nose on his sleeve. Through his tears, he could barely make out the features of the man speaking to him. But something about the stranger's tone made him pause. "I have to leave," Marcus whispered. "Everyone wants me to go. I'm ruining their movie." Stallone knelt down to Marcus's eye level, a gesture that immediately communicated respect and equality rather than adult condescension. "What's your name?" "Buddy, Marcus," the boy replied, his voice shaky but surprised by the kindness in the stranger's question. "Well, Marcus, my name is Sly, and I want you to know something. You're not ruining anything. You have just as much right to be here as anyone else in this theater." From several rows ahead, Vincent Bradley's voice cut through their conversation. "Hey, are you talking to that kid? We've already settled this. He needs to leave so the rest of us can enjoy the movie in peace." Stallone slowly stood to his full height and turned toward Vincent, his movement deliberate and powerful. Even in the dim theater lighting, there was something unmistakably authoritative about his presence. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades spent portraying characters who stood up for the underdog. "Actually, nothing's been settled," Stallone replied, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "This young man has a ticket, just like everyone else here. He has a medical condition, which means he belongs here even more than people who would shame a child for something he can't control." Vincent squinted in the darkness, trying to get a better look at this unexpected challenger to his authority. "Look, whoever you are, this isn't your business. We're talking about basic courtesy and consideration for other people." "You're absolutely right," Stallone agreed, taking a few steps down the aisle toward Vincent. "We are talking about basic courtesy and consideration. So, let me ask you something. What kind of adult thinks it's acceptable to publicly humiliate? A 12-year-old boy?" The theater had gone completely silent, except for the movie's soundtrack, which continued playing as this real-life drama unfolded. Other patrons sensed that something significant was happening, though most couldn't yet identify the man who had appointed himself as Marcus's defender. Rebecca Cooper, the woman who had earlier supported Vincent's position, spoke up from her seat. "We all feel bad for the kid, but that doesn't change the fact that his presence is making everyone uncomfortable. Sometimes life requires difficult choices." Stallone turned his attention to her, his expression a mixture of disappointment and controlled anger. "Uncomfortable? You want to talk about uncomfortable? That boy has been living with a medical condition that his family can't afford to treat. He saved money for 3 weeks to buy a ticket to this movie. He came here looking for the same thing we all did, a little joy, a little escape, a chance to feel normal. And instead of finding that, he found a room full of adults who decided that their comfort was more important than a child's dignity." Marcus watched this exchange with growing amazement. Never in his life had an adult, especially a stranger, stood up for him so forcefully and eloquently. He'd grown accustomed to being the problem that needed to be solved, the inconvenience that needed to be removed. But this man, this Sly, was treating him like someone worth defending. Vincent was growing increasingly agitated by this unexpected opposition to his reasonable demands. "Listen, friend, I don't know who you think you are, but you're not going to lecture me about parenting or social responsibility. I brought my kids here for a nice afternoon, and we shouldn't have to deal with this situation." "Your kids," Stallone repeated thoughtfully. "Let me ask you something, Vincent. That is your name, right? I heard someone call you that earlier. What lesson do you think you're teaching your children right now? What are they learning about how to treat people who are different, people who are struggling, people who need compassion instead of judgment?" This question seemed to catch Vincent off guard. He glanced back at his 2 children, who were indeed watching this confrontation with wide, curious eyes. For the first time since the argument began, Vincent appeared to consider the broader implications of his actions, but his moment of reflection was brief. "I'm teaching them that actions have consequences," Vincent replied defensively. "I'm teaching." Them that you can't just do whatever you want in public without considering other people. No, Stallone said, shaking his head slowly. You're teaching them that when someone is vulnerable, when someone is suffering, when someone needs understanding, that's when you kick them while they're down. You're teaching them that being different is something to be ashamed of, and that having less money means having fewer rights. The power of Stallone's words was evident in the shifting atmosphere of the theater. Several patrons, who had initially supported Vincent's position, were now looking uncomfortable with their earlier stance. The movie continued playing, but nobody was watching. This real-life drama had become far more compelling than anything Hollywood had put on screen. Marcus found himself standing straighter, feeling something he'd rarely experienced, the sense that someone believed he deserved respect and dignity. This stranger was fighting for him with a passion and articulation that made Marcus feel valuable, maybe for the first time in his life. Theater manager Kevin Smith, who had been standing awkwardly to the side during this exchange, finally found his voice. Sir, I appreciate your advocacy for the young man, but we do have other customers to consider. Maybe we could find a compromise that works for everyone? Stallone turned to face Kevin, and something in his expression made the young manager take an involuntary step backward. A compromise? What kind of compromise involves asking a child to give up something he worked for because adults can't demonstrate basic human decency? As Stallone continued speaking, his voice grew more passionate, more personal. You want to know what I see when I look at this situation? I see a kid who knows what it means to work for something, to save and sacrifice, and dream about a simple pleasure like going to the movies. I see a boy who's probably been bullied and marginalized his whole life because of a medical condition he didn't choose and can't control. And then I see a room full of adults who decided that their minor discomfort was more important than his right to exist in public spaces. Vincent, perhaps sensing that public opinion was beginning to shift against him, tried a different approach. Look, we're all reasonable people here, but you have to admit that some situations require practical solutions. If his condition is that severe, maybe he needs to wait until he can get proper treatment before... Before what? Stallone interrupted, his voice rising slightly for the first time. Before he's allowed to participate in normal childhood activities, before he's permitted to spend his own money on things that bring him joy, before he's considered worthy of basic respect from his community. The intensity of Stallone's defense was beginning to have a profound effect on everyone present. Marcus noticed that some of the adults who had earlier called for his removal were now avoiding eye contact, looking down at their hands, or suddenly becoming very interested in their movie snacks. A middle-aged man named Daniel Miller, who had initially remained silent during the confrontation, finally spoke up. You know what? The guy's right. We're all acting like jerks to a kid who's already dealing with enough problems. This unexpected support seemed to encourage others to reconsider their positions. A woman named Jennifer Scott nodded in agreement. I feel terrible about this whole thing. The poor boy was just trying to watch a movie. But Vincent wasn't ready to concede defeat. His authority had been challenged in front of his children and a theater full of strangers, and his ego demanded vindication. Easy for you all to say now, but you weren't sitting near the smell. You weren't having your evening ruined by someone else's problems. Stallone took several more steps down the aisle, closing the distance between himself and Vincent. As he moved closer to the front of the theater, more light from the movie screen illuminated his features. A few patrons began to whisper among themselves, recognition dawning on their faces. Someone else's problems, Stallone repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. Is that what you call a child's medical condition? Someone else's problems? Let me tell you something about problems, Vincent. Real problems aren't the kind that get solved by bullying 12-year-olds. Real problems require compassion, understanding, and sometimes Just sometimes putting someone else's needs ahead of your own comfort. The entire theater was now completely focused on this confrontation. The movie had become irrelevant background noise to the drama unfolding in real life. Marcus watched in amazement as this stranger continued to fight for him with increasing passion and eloquence. "You want to talk about ruined evenings?" Stallone continued, his voice growing more intense. "That boy's evening was ruined the moment you decided that his medical condition made him less worthy of being here. His evening was ruined when a room full of adults chose cruelty over kindness. His evening was ruined when people who should have been protecting a vulnerable child decided instead to make him the villain in their minor inconvenience." Vincent's face was reddening with anger and embarrassment. "Who the hell do you think you are to lecture me? You don't know me, you don't know my family, and you certainly don't get to tell me how to handle situations like this." For the first time since the confrontation began, Stallone smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the kind of smile that suggested someone was about to reveal information that would change everything. "You're absolutely right, Vincent," Stallone said quietly. "You don't know who I am. But maybe it's time we fix that." The tension in Theater 7 had reached a breaking point. Marcus stood frozen in the aisle, watching this incredible stranger defend him with a passion that seemed to grow stronger with each exchange. The boy had never experienced anything like this, an adult fighting for his dignity, his rights, his basic humanity. But he could sense that something even more significant was about to happen. The way this man called Sly had smiled when Vincent had challenged his identity suggested that there were layers to this confrontation that nobody had yet understood. Stallone stepped fully into the light cast by the movie screen, and for the first time, his face became clearly visible to everyone. In the theater, the gasps began immediately, starting with a teenage girl in the third row who grabbed her friend's arm and whispered urgently. Within seconds, recognition rippled through the theater like a wave, transforming the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Oh, my God," someone whispered loudly. "That's Rocky." "It's Sylvester Stallone," another voice confirmed, the awe evident in their tone. Vincent's expression changed dramatically as the reality of the situation hit him. The man he'd been arguing with, the stranger who had so eloquently defended the boy, wasn't just some random moviegoer with strong opinions about justice and compassion. He was one of the most recognizable faces in American cinema, a man whose entire career had been built on stories about underdogs, outsiders, and people who refused to give up in the face of overwhelming odds. Marcus looked up at his defender with new eyes. Though the revelation didn't change his gratitude, it only deepened his amazement. This wasn't just any adult standing up for him. This was Rocky Balboa, John Rambo, a man whose movie characters had inspired millions of people to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless. "Mr. Stallone," Kevin Smith stammered, the theater manager suddenly realizing that his simple Saturday afternoon had become something extraordinary. We didn't know you were here. Is there anything we can do to make this situation better?" Stallone's attention remained focused on Vincent, who was now looking considerably less confident than he had moments earlier. The dynamic had shifted entirely. No longer was this an argument between a concerned parent and an overzealous stranger. This was now a confrontation between a Hollywood legend and a man who had just publicly bullied a child in front of one of the most famous advocates for the underdog in entertainment history. "Vincent," Stallone said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority, "I want you to understand something. I've spent my entire career telling stories about people like Marcus, people who face challenges they didn't choose, people who get knocked down and have to find the strength to get back up. People who discover that their greatest battles aren't with external enemies, but with a world that doesn't always show them the kindness they deserve." The theater had become completely silent, except for the movie's soundtrack, which continued. To play as this real-life drama unfolded, parents pulled their children closer, not out of concern for their safety, but because they sensed they were witnessing something important, something that would be talked about and remembered long after. The credits rolled. When I created Rocky Balboa, Stallone continued, I was writing about every person who's ever been told they don't belong, every person who's ever been counted out before they had a chance to prove themselves. I was writing about people like Marcus, who face their battles with dignity, even when the world around them lacks compassion. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes again, but these were different from the tears of humiliation he'd shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of feeling seen and understood in a way he'd never experienced before. This famous man, this legend, was comparing him to Rocky Balboa, not in terms of boxing ability, but in terms of courage and resilience. Vincent attempted to salvage his position. Mr. Stallone, I'm a huge fan of your work. I've seen every Rocky, a movie multiple times. But surely you can understand that in real-life situations, we have to balance idealism with practical considerations. This isn't a movie script. This is real life with real consequences. Stallone's expression hardened at Vincent's attempt to separate his movie characters from his real-world values. You think my stories are just entertainment? You think the messages about standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves are just movie scripts? Let me tell you something, Vincent. Every character I've ever played, every story I've ever told, comes from real life. It comes from understanding what it means to be an outsider, to be different, to need someone to believe in you when everyone else has written you off. The actor's voice grew more personal, more intense. I grew up poor, Vincent. I slept in bus stations and subway terminals. I had a speech impediment that made me the target of bullies and cruel comments. I know exactly what it feels like to be the kid everyone wants to get rid of, the problem everyone wants to solve by making him disappear. This personal revelation added another layer of depth to the confrontation. Marcus realized that his defender wasn't just speaking from professional experience or general principles of fairness. He was speaking from lived experience, from his own memories of being marginalized and misunderstood. When I see what you did to Marcus, Stallone continued, I see every bully who ever made fun of my speech. I see every person who ever told me I didn't belong somewhere because I looked different or sounded different or came from the wrong side of town. And I see every adult who stood by and let it happen because it was easier than standing up for what was right. Rebecca Cooper, who had earlier supported Vincent's position, spoke up hesitantly. Mr. Stallone, we weren't trying to be cruel. We were just... It was a difficult situation. Stallone turned to face her, his expression showing disappointment rather than anger. Rebecca, isn't it? Let me ask you something. If Marcus were your son, if he were dealing with a medical condition your family couldn't afford to treat, if he had saved his allowance for weeks to afford one afternoon of normal childhood fun, would you want other adults to show him compassion? Or would you want them to shame him into leaving? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Rebecca looked down at her own children, imagining them in Marcus's position, and her expression began to change. I wouldn't want my children to be treated that way, she admitted quietly. Then why, Stallone asked, his voice gentle but pointed, would you treat someone else's child that way? Meanwhile, other patrons throughout the theater were beginning to speak up, and their comments revealed how dramatically public opinion had shifted. David Brown called out, "The kid should be able to stay. This is wrong." Jennifer Cox added, "I feel terrible about how we've been acting." One by one, people who had initially supported Marcus's removal were now advocating for his right to remain. But Vincent wasn't ready to accept defeat. His pride had been wounded, his authority challenged, and his parenting decisions questioned. In front of his own children, "Mr. Stallone, with all due respect, you're turning this into something it's not. This isn't about bullying or discrimination. This is about practical considerations and common courtesy. If someone's medical condition affects other people's experiences, shouldn't there be reasonable accommodations that work for everyone? Stallone stepped closer to Vincent, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of his decades in Hollywood, his understanding of human nature, and his personal experience with adversity. Vincent, let me tell you what I see when I look at this situation. I see a man who's more concerned with his own comfort than with a child's dignity. I see someone who's trying to dress up selfishness as reasonableness, cruelty as practicality. You want to talk about common courtesy? Common courtesy would have been offering to help. Common courtesy would have been showing compassion to a child dealing with a medical condition. Common courtesy would have been setting a positive example for your own children about how we treat people who are struggling. The impact of these words was visible not just on Vincent, but throughout the entire theater. Parents were looking at their own children, wondering what lessons they had just taught them. Adults were reconsidering their own reactions and finding them wanting. Marcus, still standing in the aisle, felt something shifting inside himself. For the first time in his life, he was seeing what it looked like when someone refused to be intimidated, when someone stood up for what was right regardless of social pressure or personal convenience. He was learning that he had value, that his struggles mattered, that his right to exist in public spaces was non-negotiable. You know what the real tragedy is here? Stallone continued, his voice growing more passionate. Marcus came to this theater looking for heroes on the screen. He came here hoping to see stories about people who overcome impossible odds, people who find strength in adversity, people who discover that being different doesn't make them less worthy of respect. Instead, he found a room full of adults who taught him that real life doesn't have heroes, that when you need someone to stand up for you, you'll be disappointed. The theater manager, Kevin Smith, finally found his courage. Mr. Stallone is right. Marcus, you're welcome to stay and enjoy the movie. We're sorry this happened to you. But Stallone wasn't finished. He had more to say, more lessons to teach, and more wounds to heal. The revelation of his identity had shifted the power dynamic, but it hadn't yet addressed the deeper issues at play, issues about dignity, compassion, and what it truly means to be a hero in real life rather than on screen. Vincent's children were watching their father with new eyes, beginning to understand that their hero dad had been the villain in this story. Other families throughout the theater were having quiet conversations about what they had witnessed and participated in. And Marcus was beginning to understand that sometimes, when everything seems hopeless, heroes do appear, not always in the form you expect, but exactly when you need them most. The afternoon was far from over. The real lessons were just beginning. The atmosphere in Theater 7 had transformed completely. What had begun as a cruel confrontation designed to humiliate a vulnerable child had become something entirely different, a masterclass in standing up for human dignity, delivered by one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. But Stallone wasn't finished. He understood that true change required more than just stopping bad behavior. It required healing, learning, and transformation. Marcus remained in the aisle, no longer crying, but watching in amazement as this legendary figure continued to fight for his right to simply exist in public spaces. The boy was beginning to understand that he was witnessing something rare and precious, a moment when someone with real power chose to use it on behalf of someone who had none. "Vincent," Stallone said, his voice now carrying a different tone, less confrontational, more educational. "I want you to think about something. Your children have been watching this entire interaction. They've seen their father choose to humiliate a child rather than show compassion. They've learned that when someone is different, when someone is struggling, the appropriate response is to make them go away rather than make them feel welcome. Is that really the lesson you want to teach them?" Vincent glanced back at his two Children, 8-year-old Emma and 10-year-old Michael, who were indeed watching with wide, confused eyes. They had come to the movies, expecting an afternoon of entertainment, not a lesson in human cruelty and redemption. Vincent's expression began to soften as he truly looked at his children, not as extensions of his own ego, but as young people, forming their understanding of how the world works. Vincent began, then stopped. For the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to be genuinely considering the implications of his actions rather than simply defending his position. Stallone sensed the shift and pressed forward, but his approach became gentler, more therapeutic than adversarial. "You know, Vincent, I've learned something over the years about being a father and a role model. Children don't just listen to what we tell them about right and wrong. They watch what we do when we think nobody important is paying attention. They learn from how we treat the most vulnerable people in our society." Throughout the theater, other parents were having similar realizations. Rebecca Cooper was whispering to her own children, apparently apologizing for her earlier behavior. Daniel Miller had moved closer to Marcus, offering him a supportive smile. The collective consciousness of the room was shifting from self-interest to empathy, but Stallone's attention remained focused on healing rather than simply winning the argument. He understood that lasting change required helping people understand, not just what they had done wrong, but what they could do better going forward. "Marcus," Stallone said, turning to address the boy directly, "I want you to understand something important. What happened here today isn't about you. It's not because you did anything wrong, and it's not because you don't deserve to be here. Sometimes when people are uncomfortable or frustrated, they look for someone to blame instead of looking for ways to help or understand." Marcus nodded, absorbing these words like a lifeline. Throughout his young life, he had internalized the message that his condition made him a burden, that his presence was something to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Hearing these truths from someone he now recognized as a childhood hero was beginning to heal wounds he didn't even realize he carried. "You saved money for 3 weeks to come here," Stallone continued, his voice warm with respect. "That shows dedication, responsibility, and the ability to work toward goals. Those are qualities that will serve you well throughout your life, Marcus. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of who you are or what you're dealing with." Theater. Manager Kevin Smith stepped forward, clearly moved by what he had witnessed. "Marcus, I want to personally apologize for how this situation was handled. You're absolutely welcome here. And if anyone gives you trouble in the future, you come find me immediately." This gesture of support from the theater management seemed to encourage others to step forward as well. Amanda Kim, the teenager who had sold Marcus his ticket, appeared from the lobby where she'd been listening to the commotion. "Marcus," Amanda said, approaching with a large popcorn and drink, "these are on the house, and I want you to know that you're one of our favorite customers. You're always polite, always patient, and you clearly love movies as much as we do." The kindness was overwhelming. Marcus, who had entered the theater feeling alone and unwelcome, was suddenly surrounded by people expressing support and regret for their earlier behavior. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. Stallone walked over to Marcus and knelt down to his eye level once again. "Marcus, can I tell you a secret? Some of my best friends, some of the strongest people I know, are people who deal with medical conditions that make life more challenging. They've taught me that real strength isn't about being perfect or having everything easy. Real strength is about showing up anyway, about pursuing your dreams even when it's difficult, about maintaining your dignity when other people forget theirs." The boy nodded, hanging on every word. This conversation was changing something fundamental in how he saw himself and his place in the world. "I want to make you an offer," Stallone continued. "How would you like to finish watching this movie? Sitting right next to me. I was planning to find a seat anyway, and I think we might both enjoy the company." Marcus's eyes widened with disbelief. You want to sit with me? I can't think of anyone I'd rather sit with, Stallone replied, with complete sincerity. You've shown more courage in the last 30 minutes than most people show in a lifetime. It would be an honor. The impact of this gesture rippled throughout the theater. Vincent's children were watching with amazement as this famous man chose to befriend the boy their father had tried to humiliate. Other patrons were witnessing a masterclass in how to transform a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for connection and healing. Vincent finally found his voice, and when he spoke, his tone was completely different from the aggressive authority he had displayed earlier. Mr. Stallone, Marcus, I owe you both an apology. I was wrong. I was thinking only about my own comfort and convenience, and I forgot about basic human decency. He turned to face his children, his voice heavy with regret. Emma, Michael, I want you to understand that what I did earlier was wrong. Marcus deserves the same respect and kindness that we would want if we were in his situation. I'm sorry you had to see your dad behave that way. The sincerity of Vincent's apology was evident, and it seemed to lift a weight from the entire theater. Other parents followed his example, turning to their own children to process what they had witnessed and learned. Rebecca Cooper approached Marcus with her family. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry for how we treated you. My children and I would like to make it up to you somehow. Would you like us to save your seat if you need to step out at any point during the movie? This offer of practical support was exactly what Marcus had needed from the beginning. Not removal or shame, but accommodation and understanding. The difference between what had happened initially and what was happening now illustrated perfectly the choice between cruelty and compassion. As Stallone and Marcus settled into seats in the back row, Stallone having insisted on taking the seat next to Marcus rather than asking the boy to move, the legendary actor had one more lesson to share. Marcus, I want you to remember this day not because of how it started, but because of how it ended. You came here alone, but you're not leaving alone. You came here feeling ashamed, but you're leaving with your dignity intact. Most importantly, you've learned that even when things seem hopeless, sometimes heroes show up, and sometimes you discover that you were the hero all along. The movie resumed its proper place as the focus of attention, but the real drama had concluded with lessons that would last far longer than any Hollywood production. Marcus settled into his seat next to his new friend, finally able to enjoy the film he had worked so hard to afford. But more than that, he was able to enjoy it with the knowledge that he belonged there, that his presence was valued, and that sometimes when you most need someone to believe in you, the universe provides exactly the right person, at exactly the right moment. Vincent spent the remainder of the movie reflecting on the lessons his children had learned, both from his initial cruelty and from his eventual accountability. Other families throughout the theater had similar conversations, processing what they had witnessed and learned about compassion, dignity, and the choice between being a bystander and being a hero. As the credits rolled and the lights came up, Marcus realized that he had indeed found heroes that afternoon, not just on the movie screen, but sitting right beside him and scattered throughout the theater in the form of people who had chosen kindness over comfort, understanding over judgment. The boy who had entered Theater 7, feeling alone and unwelcome, left with phone numbers of new friends, an open invitation to return anytime, and most importantly, a transformed understanding of his own worth and place in the world. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't the ones we watch on screen, but the ones we live when ordinary moments become extraordinary through the simple choice to treat each other with dignity and respect. And sometimes, when a boy is kicked out of a theater for something he can't control, a legend takes the seat beside him and reminds everyone present what it truly means to be a hero.